Doctors gave him 48 hours to live. Rocco Valenti, 36 years old, the most feared name in Chicago's underworld, was lying in a private medical suite with 3 bullet holes in his chest, and not a single soul left who wanted him alive. His empire had turned its back overnight. The people he'd trusted most were the first to disappear. A $2 million bounty was already circling the streets, and a professional killer was walking the halls disguised as a medical technician, carrying a syringe loaded with enough potassium chloride to stop a human heart in under 10 seconds. Everyone expected an easy target, a dying man with no allies and no way out. But nobody counted on Sadie Langston, 27, invisible, a night shift janitor who mopped floors for $14.50 an hour. No training, no weapons, and no reason to care about the man behind that door. But Sadie had already lost someone she couldn't save, her little brother, who died in her arms because the world decided he wasn't worth enough to keep alive. And she'd sworn she'd never let it happen again, no matter who was on that bed. What happened inside room 301 at 2 a.m. turned a janitor's mop bucket into the last line of defense between a crime lord and certain death. If this story grabs you and doesn't let go, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs a good story tonight. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a tale like this. Now, let's go back to the night Rocco Valenti was brought through the back door of Lakewood Private Hospital, bleeding out in the rain, and find out how a woman with nothing risked everything for a man who deserved nothing. That night, Chicago rained as if the sky had never broken open before. Water came down in thick, relentless sheets, turning the northern suburban roads into black rivers glittering beneath the sodium lights. The black SUV tore through the back gate of Lakewood Private Hospital fast enough for its tires to rip into the white gravel of the parking lot. Holt Brennan kicked the door open and rushed out into the rain, his left shoulder bearing the full weight of Rocco Valenti. Blood ran through Holt's fingers, mixed with the rainwater, and spread into pale pink streaks across the concrete. Rocco was unconscious. His head sagged to one side, his mouth hung slightly open, and his skin was gray as old newspaper. Holt kicked open the clinic's back door and shouted down the empty hallway near midnight, with the voice of a man who could see death sitting right beside him. Dr. Raymond Whitfield was in the first floor on-call room when the shout reached him. He stepped out, looked at Holt, looked at Rocco, looked at the blood dripping onto the white tile floor. And he didn't ask a single question. He didn't ask what had happened, didn't ask who had fired the shot, didn't ask whether they should call the police. Whitfield had worked at Lakewood long enough to know there were patients for whom questions were a luxury no one paid for. He only called 2 short words to the nurse on duty, then pulled out a stretcher and pushed Rocco straight into surgery. The operating room door closed. The surgical lights came on. And the next 6 hours became a battle between Whitfield's hands and death itself. A ruptured spleen, a punctured right lung, 40% of the blood in Rocco's body was already outside his body. Whitfield stitched, clamped, reconnected, transfused blood, then stitched again. When he finally stepped out of the operating room, dawn had begun to pale beyond the windows. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy and gray, as if they weren't ready to let go. Whitfield peeled off his blood-stained gloves, threw them into the medical waste bin, and looked at Holt, who was standing against the opposite wall, his eyes bloodshot from not blinking for 6 straight hours. Whitfield only shook his head slowly, the kind of head shake he saved for cases balanced on the border between life and death, when he didn't dare lean toward either side. Holt swallowed. He stepped into the hallway, took out his phone, and dialed a single number. The person on the other end answered after 2 rings. Holt spoke briefly, his voice hoarse from exhaustion, reporting everything: the location, the condition, the prognosis. The other end stayed silent for a few seconds, then answered in a low, warm voice, slow and steady, so calm it almost sounded gentle. "I'll handle everything. You just stay there and keep watch." Holt hung up. He wanted to believe that promise. He needed to believe it, but there was something in that voice that unsettled him, something he couldn't yet name, like the smell of milk about to turn sour, something the eyes haven't seen yet but the nose already knows. At the end of the first-floor hallway, about 20 steps from the operating room, Sadie Langston was pushing a mop cart along the wall, earbuds in her ears, messy brown hair tied high to bare the back of her neck, dark blue janitor's uniform at least 2 sizes too large for her body. She'd been there when the SUV flew into the parking lot. She'd heard Holt's shout echo from the back door. She'd seen him rush through the hallway in a white shirt stained red from shoulder to waist, his face twisted with panic. the eyes of a man losing the most important thing in his life, and Sadie had done what she always did. She moved against the wall, lowered her head, and became part of the wall, part of the floor, part of the furniture. Invisible. No one looked at her. No one ever looked at her. She liked it that way. 6 hours later, after Whitfield left the operating room and Holt walked away to make the call, Sadie received orders from the nurse on duty to clean the surgical room. She pushed her cart inside. The first smell that struck her face was the sharp, heavy stench of iron, a smell she knew far better than anyone should at 27. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, on the operating table, on discarded gloves, on red-soaked gauze piled in a stainless steel tray. She looked at that amount of blood. She stood still. Not because she was afraid. She wasn't afraid of blood. She'd been used to blood long before she ever set foot in Lakewood. She stood still because that smell dragged her back to another room, another hospital, 4 years earlier, where she held Tommy in her arms while the monitor gave out one long, unbroken beep, and no one came in to save him. Sadie drew a long breath. Then she wrung out the rag, knelt down, and began to wipe. Every streak of blood, every dark red smear across the white tile, she cleaned it all away. She didn't know who the man on that operating table was. She didn't know what he had done, or whether he would live or die. She only knew there was a great deal of blood, and someone had to wipe it away, and that someone was always her. 2 days passed, and room 301 became the quietest place in all of Lakewood. Rocco Valenti lay motionless on the bed, eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the ventilator, his body webbed with IV lines and electrodes. The monitor blinked steadily, drawing thin green waves across a black screen, the only proof that somewhere inside that stitched-up chest, something was still beating. Outside the glass door, Holt Brennan sat on a white plastic hospital chair, his back straight, both hands resting on his thighs, and beneath his brown leather jacket was the Glock he hadn't taken his hand off since the first night. Holt didn't sleep, not because he wasn't tired, but because every time his eyes grew heavy and began to close, he saw Rocco again in the SUV, head sagging, skin gray, blood soaking the leather seat, and he woke as if he'd never been tired at all. For the first 24 hours, Holt waited. He waited for the phone to ring, waited for familiar footsteps from the elevator, waited for the faces he'd seen around Rocco for the past 10 years to appear at the end of the hallway. He waited for the lawyer to arrive with a leather briefcase and a cold face. He waited for someone to bring clean clothes for the boss, a suit, a pair of shoes, at least a t-shirt. He waited for flowers, waited for envelopes, waited for any sign that the Valenti Empire still existed out there. Nothing came. Holt's phone lay on his thigh, its screen dark, absolutely silent, as useless as a brick. No calls, no messages, not a single line of text. The world Rocco Valenti had built with sweat, blood, and other people's fear had evaporated in less than 48 hours, faster than the blood had left his body on the operating table. Holt called the number from the first night again. This time, it took 5 rings before someone answered. The voice on the other end was still calm, still deep and warm, but now there was something else Holt hadn't noticed before, or hadn't wanted to notice, and that was indifference. "You just stay there and keep watch. I'm handling everything outside. The situation is more complicated than you think." Holt wanted to ask what he was handling, what was complicated, why no one had come, why an entire empire had vanished as if it had never existed, but he didn't ask. Because deep in his gut, in a place reason hadn't reached yet but instinct had already touched, Holt was beginning to feel something he didn't dare name. Something was wrong. Wrong from the first night, wrong from the first phone call, wrong from that voice too calm for a man who should have been panicked after hearing that his own nephew was dying. But Holt pushed it away, because admitting it meant admitting that Rocco Valenti, the boss who controlled half of Chicago's underworld, was completely alone in a hospital room with only one exhausted bodyguard and a gun, and Holt wasn't ready to live with that truth. Every night, around 11 o'clock, Sadie pushed her mop cart onto the 3rd floor. She started at the end of the hallway and worked her way toward the elevator, one tile at a time, one corner at a time, steady and silent as a shadow. Every night, she passed room 301, and every night, she saw the same thing. Holt sitting there, cold coffee on the floor beside the chair leg, dark circles hollowed deep beneath his eyes. The same clothes from the first night, now wrinkled and carrying the smell of old sweat. He didn't look at her. No one looked at her, but Sadie looked at him. And through the glass of room 301, she looked at the man inside, a sharp, angled face, bruised from cheekbone to jaw, a breathing tube fixed in his mouth, IV lines running from his wrist to 3 bags hanging on a metal stand. She didn't know his name, didn't know what he did, where he lived, whom he loved, whom he hated. She only knew one thing, and she knew it better than anything in the world. She knew the sight of a human being slowly dying, while the world beyond the door kept turning as if nothing had happened. She had seen it once before, 4 years earlier, in a crowded emergency room at a public hospital, when Tommy lay on a bed with yellowed skin and eyes too exhausted to even be afraid, while Sadie sat beside him holding his hand, and nurses moved back and forth in the hallway without anyone stopping. Sadie didn't think about Tommy every time she looked into room 301. She didn't need to think. Her body remembered for her, the stab in her chest, the tightness in her throat, the familiar helplessness of someone standing outside the glass, watching life drain out of another person and being unable to do anything. On the second night, Sadie stopped in front of room 301 longer than usual. Only a few extra seconds. Then she lowered her head and pushed the cart onward. At the end of the second day, Dr. Whitfield entered the room to examine him. He checked the vital signs chart, inspected the incision, listened to his lungs, then stepped out with an expression Holt couldn't decode, somewhere between surprise and reluctant admission. "This guy's stubborn," Whitfield said, removing the stethoscope from his neck. "All his numbers are moving in the right direction. It's not time to open the champagne, but he's fighting death, and he hasn't given up yet." Holt breathed out for the first time in 48 hours. But the news that Rocco Valenti was still alive didn't stay inside room 301. It spread, through the nurse on duty, through the security guard downstairs, through calls Holt couldn't control, beyond Lakewood's walls, into the ears of people who had been waiting for an obituary. And somewhere in the city of Chicago, there was someone who received that news and wasn't happy at all. On the fourth night, at around 11:45, Sadie was cleaning the second-floor medical waste area when she saw it. The work in the waste area wasn't something anyone dreamed of doing, but Sadie had done it long enough to turn it into a rhythm of breathing. Regular trash, biohazard waste, sharps containers for used needles and broken medical vials, each kind had its own procedure, each kind had its own place, and after 2 years, Sadie knew exactly what belonged where. An IV bottle shouldn't be in the sharps container. An empty IV bottle belonged in the pharmaceutical waste bin, the yellow plastic bag, on the left side of the wall, 3 steps away from the sharps container. But tonight, lying carelessly among used syringes and broken test tubes, was a 500 milliliter IV bottle, its label printed clearly, sodium chloride 0.9%, normal saline, the most common thing in any medical facility. Sadie almost ignored it. She almost picked it up, tossed it into the right bin, and kept working. But her hand stopped halfway. The liquid inside the bottle wasn't right. Sodium chloride 0.9% was normal saline, completely clear as filtered water, colorless and odorless. This bottle was cloudy. Not obviously cloudy like milk, but subtly cloudy, faintly hazed, slightly off, the kind of cloudiness you wouldn't notice if you only glanced once. But if you'd looked at thousands of bottles of normal saline over 2 years, looked at them every night while wiping medication shelves, cleaning rooms after IV treatments, stocking supplies in storage, then you knew. Sadie knew. She lifted the bottle to eye level beneath the fluorescent light. The liquid inside shimmered with a faint murkiness when she tilted it gently. She wasn't a pharmacist, wasn't a nurse, wasn't a doctor. She was a janitor. But 2 years of cleaning up thousands of saline bottles had given her something no university could teach: the instinct of repetition. When you've looked at something enough times, you don't need to understand it to know when it's wrong. Sadie set the bottle down. She didn't throw it back into the trash. She went down to the first floor, into the nurse's station, where she wiped the desk every night and knew the place of every sheet of paper, every logbook, every pen. She opened the shift handoff book and turned to that day's page. The evening shift note said clearly, "IV changed in room 301, 10 o'clock at night, performed by Nurse Bonnie." Sadie looked at that line and felt something cold run down her spine. The IV change schedule for room 301 was midnight, not 10 o'clock, 2 hours early, and the person listed was Bonnie. But Bonnie wasn't here. Sadie had seen Bonnie's name on the staff room notice board that afternoon, Written clearly in red pen. Sick leave since Tuesday. Sore throat. Expected to return next Monday. Bonnie was at home. Bonnie couldn't have changed anyone's IV tonight. So who had written Bonnie's name in the shift book? And who had hung that strangely cloudy IV bottle for the man in room 301? Sadie stood in the deserted nurse's station, both hands gripping the edge of the desk. She wasn't a detective. She didn't have proof. She had only one bottle of saline that didn't look right, one name that shouldn't have appeared in the shift book, and the cold feeling along her spine that she'd learned to trust when she was a 9-year-old child in the foster care system, where reading signs of danger before it happened was the only survival skill no one taught, but everyone had to know. Sadie didn't call the police. She didn't call security. She didn't call Dr. Whitfield. She didn't have enough evidence to call anyone without being dismissed as a paranoid janitor. Instead, she did the only thing she could do. She went down to the supply room on the 2nd floor, the place she cleaned every week and knew the passcode to because she was the one who wiped the keypad every Monday. 4 numbers. She remembered because her 4 fingers touched those 4 buttons every week when she opened the door to sweep inside. She took a new bottle of sodium chloride, factory sealed, perfectly clear. Then she went up to the 3rd floor. Holt was still sitting outside room 301, but the 4th night had begun to wear him down. Holt's eyes were heavier than ever. His shoulders had started to sag, and at around 12:15, he stood up for the first time in hours to go into the restroom at the end of the hallway. Sadie waited. She stood at the hallway corner with her mop cart, pretending to clean the tile beside the fire cabinet. And when Holt's shadow disappeared behind the restroom door, she moved, fast, light, without a sound. She slipped into room 301 and left the glass door slightly ajar. The only light came from the green blink of the monitor screen and the indicator light on the infusion pump. Rocco Valenti lay there, motionless, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the ventilator. Sadie didn't look at his face. She looked at the IV bottle hanging from the stand. She removed it quickly, attached the new bottle, checked the line, and made sure the fluid was flowing steadily. 20 seconds, maybe 30. Then she turned, took the old bottle, and stepped out. But in the moment she turned her back, on the hospital bed, Rocco moved. Not a conscious movement. He was still sunk deep in a coma, in a place where consciousness was only broken pieces of dim light drifting through a dense darkness. But some part of his brain, the most primitive part, the part anesthesia couldn't reach, recognized that someone was there. Not Holt. Holt's footsteps were heavy, always accompanied by tired breathing and the smell of old coffee. Not a nurse. Nurses came in with the clatter of medication trays and the scent of hand sanitizer. This person was different. The footsteps were so light, they were almost nothing, and the scent was something simple, clean, familiar, something his brain couldn't name. Floor soap. The smell of floor soap passed briefly beneath his nose, light as a breath of wind, then vanished at the same time the glass door closed. The next morning, Holt checked the room as usual and realized the IV bottle had been changed. He asked the nurse on duty. No one admitted changing it. He asked the evening shift nurse from the day before. No one knew. He looked at the new IV bottle, factory sealed, the right kind, the right dose, hanging in the right place, as if someone had known exactly what they were doing. Holt stood in the middle of room 301, looked around, and for the first time in 4 days, he felt something besides exhaustion and fear. Someone was interfering. Someone was quietly touching his patient without leaving a trace. The question wasn't who, because he would find out. The question was whose side that person was on. On the 6th day, Dr. Whitfield stepped into room 301 for a routine check and stayed beside the bed longer than usual. The index finger of Rocco's right hand was moving, not a random twitch, but a rhythmic motion, repeating again and again, as if someone were knocking on the door of consciousness from the other side. Whitfield lifted Rocco's eyelid, shone a small flashlight into it, and saw something he hadn't dared to expect. The pupil was reacting to the light, and the eyeball was moving slowly from left to right beneath the closed lid. "He's trying to come back," Whitfield told Holt outside the glass door, his voice carrying something almost like respect. "His body is fighting minute by minute." Holt breathed out for the first time in 6 days. But good news never belongs only to the people who need it. In a private hospital with a thin night staff, where nurses cared for patients while gossiping over the phone, and security guards drank coffee with supply truck drivers, information moved faster than any drug through an IV line. Rocco Valenti was showing signs of waking up. That sentence didn't take more than a few hours to travel from the mouth of the nurse on duty into the ear of someone outside Lakewood. Someone whose reaction this time was faster, more urgent, carrying the desperate smell of a man watching his plan slip out of his hands. At 1 o'clock in the morning on the 6th night, Sadie was mopping the third-floor hallway when she heard the service elevator doors open at the eastern end of the corridor. The service elevator was used for moving equipment and laundry, and almost no one used it at night except Sadie. A man stepped out, wearing a gray-blue maintenance uniform, an HVAC company logo on his chest, a black plastic toolbox in his hand, walking quickly and deliberately straight toward the HVAC mechanical room at the end of the hallway, the room that controlled the entire ventilation system and emergency oxygen backup for the VIP rooms. Sadie watched from the corner of her eye, her hands still wringing the rag over the mop. The uniform was right, the name badge was right, the toolbox was right, but she knew Lakewood's HVAC maintenance schedule because she cleaned the mechanical room every Monday and had to wait for the technicians to finish before she could mop inside. Maintenance was scheduled for Monday. Today was Thursday. There was no maintenance scheduled on Thursday, and there certainly wasn't any scheduled at 1 o'clock in the morning. Sadie's stomach tightened, and the cold feeling along her spine came back stronger than it had on the 4th night. If someone shut off the backup oxygen and adjusted the ventilator to its lowest setting, Rocco would stop breathing in his sleep. The doctor would call it equipment failure. No trace, no proof. Sadie didn't confront him. She knew that when you were small and no one believed your words, direct confrontation was the fastest way to lose. She acted in less than 2 minutes. She poured a 20-liter bucket of water right in front of the HVAC mechanical room door, set up a yellow warning sign that read, "Wet floor, electrical hazard," then went down to the 2nd floor and pulled the manual fire alarm on the wall near the west stairwell. The fire alarm tore through Lakewood at 1:15 in the morning. Emergency lights flashed red throughout the building. Night security guard Perry Dunn jolted awake and ran upstairs. The nurse on duty opened the door and looked out. Holt sprang up from his chair, his hand slipping inside his jacket to grip the handle of his gun, and the fake technician was standing in front of the 3rd-floor mechanical room door, in the middle of a puddle, toolbox in hand, while the fire alarm shrieked and the red lights flashed over and over. Perry was the first to reach him. He looked at the man, looked at the puddle, and asked bluntly, with no time left for politeness, "What are you doing here at this hour?" The man stammered something about checking the system, an emergency maintenance schedule. Perry demanded work authorization papers. The man searched his pockets and couldn't find any. Perry told him he had to leave the building immediately, especially with the entire facility under a fire alarm. The man had no choice. He took his toolbox, stepped into the service elevator, and disappeared into the dark night without getting the chance to touch a single valve. 15 minutes later, the fire department confirmed there was no fire. Lakewood became quiet again. No one knew what had really happened except Sadie, who was now mopping up the puddle in front of the mechanical room with the calm face of a janitor cleaning up after some dull accident. In room 301, Rocco was dreaming. He was sinking through thick black water, ice cold, his lungs tightening, his mouth open but finding no air, only darkness pouring in. Then something touched his wrist, not a strong arm yanking him hard, but a small hand, gentle and patient, pulling him toward the surface. Rocco opened his eyes for a split second. His eyelids parted just enough to let the light in. The hallway light slipped through the narrow gap of the glass door, and in that thin strip of brightness, he saw a figure. Small, slender, hair tied high, a mop in her hand, standing outside the glass door in silence, watching his room. Then that figure turned away, pushed her mop cart, and vanished into the dark hallway. Rocco's eyelids closed again, and the dream pulled him back under. But this time the black water was no longer cold, and in the darkness, faint and passing, there was the smell of floor soap. On the 8th day, at 6:17 in the morning, Rocco Valenti opened his eyes. Not a faint parting and closing again like that blurry second on the 6th night. This time his eyes opened fully, his dark gray pupils widening, then shrinking when the ceiling light struck them, and he saw the ceiling, white, flat, strange. Not his ceiling. Then the pain hit, not gradually, but all at once, as if his body had been waiting for consciousness to return, so it could pour out everything it had gathered over 8 days. His chest burned. His abdomen tightened around stitches he hadn't seen yet but could feel one by one, and his right lung, the lung that had been punctured and patched, made a thin rasping sound every time he breathed in deeper than the ventilator allowed. He wanted to scream, but the breathing tube in his throat turned the scream into a choked, broken wheeze. His eyes watered, not from the pain, but because memory was coming back faster than the pain. And the first memory wasn't the gunshot. It wasn't the sound of bullets tearing through the air or the sound of shell casings falling onto the concrete floor of the warehouse. The first memory was a face. The face that had stood about 10 steps away from him in the warehouse that night. Calm, not panicked, not angry, not regretful, just calm. Like someone watching a dull weather report on television. That face had stood there and watched when the first bullet went through his shoulder. Had stood there and watched when the second bullet tore through his chest. And had still stood there, with the same calm expression, when the third bullet buried itself in his abdomen, and he fell onto the ice-cold concrete floor in a pool of his own blood. Rocco knew that face. He'd looked at that face for all 36 years of his life. He knew who had done this. But he didn't speak yet. Not yet. He turned his head to the right, slowly, painfully, centimeter by centimeter. Through the glass of room 301, he saw Holt Brennan sitting outside, and he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 8 days. His eyes were sunken deep, his beard rough and uneven, his clothes so wrinkled they'd almost lost their shape. But his back was still straight and his right hand was still under his jacket, where Rocco knew the Glock was resting. Holt looked into the room, saw Rocco's eyes open, and in that instant, his exhausted face broke open. Not into a smile, not into a shout of joy, only his bloodshot eyes suddenly turning wet, and his jaw tightening, then trembling slightly, the tremble of a man who'd held back tears for too long. Holt stepped into the room, pulled a chair close to the bed, and bent low enough that Rocco wouldn't have to speak loudly. Rocco looked at him, then looked around the room, at the door, at the empty hallway outside, at the empty chair opposite where another guard should have been sitting, then looked back at Holt. He asked, his voice only a hoarse breath through the breathing tube, 2 words, "Who's left?" Holt went silent, not the silence of a man thinking of how to answer, but the silence of a man who knew the answer would hurt more than any bullet. Then he said it, "Only me, boss." Those 4 words fell into room 301 heavier than anything that had ever fallen there. Heavier than gunfire, heavier than the fire alarm, heavier than all 8 days of coma. Rocco didn't react. His face didn't change, didn't crease, didn't twitch. He only closed his eyes, very slowly, then opened them again. The empire he'd built since he was 25, with blood, with fear, with loyalty he'd believed was absolute, had dissolved in 8 days. And the only person still sitting here was one exhausted bodyguard with a gun. Holt swallowed, then began to tell him, not like a report, but like a man who had held too much inside for too long and now finally had someone to speak to. He told him about the 4th night, about the IV bottle being changed when no one admitted doing it, about the new factory-sealed bottle hanging in the right place, as if someone had known exactly what they were doing. He told him about the 6th night, about the HVAC maintenance technician who appeared at 1 o'clock in the morning on a day with no maintenance scheduled, blocked by a puddle and a fire alarm before he could touch the oxygen system. And he told him about what he'd found when he reviewed the security cameras in the 3rd floor hallway. A shadow, a dark blue uniform, a small frame, hair tied high. She appeared on camera every night, mopping floors, pushing her cart, invisible as part of the building. But Holt had noticed a pattern. Every time something unusual happened around room 301, that shadow was nearby. On the 4th night, the camera recorded her moving toward room 301 right around the time the IV bottle was changed. On the 6th night, she appeared in the 3rd floor hallway 10 minutes before the fire alarm went off. Not coincidence. Not random. Someone was protecting Rocco Valenti from the darkness, with a bucket of water and a mop, and that someone was the night shift janitor. Rocco listened to all of it without saying a word, his face expressionless, his dark gray eyes fixed on the ceiling, but Holt knew the boss was processing every piece of information like the machine he'd always been. When Holt finished, the silence stretched long enough for Holt to begin wondering whether Rocco was still conscious. Then Rocco spoke, his voice hoarse but unmistakably cold and sharp. 2 words Holt understood at once weren't a request, but an order. Find her. That night, around 11:30, Sadie pushed her mop cart onto the 3rd floor like she did every night. She started at the end of the hallway, mopping her way slowly toward the elevator. And when she reached room 303, 2 rooms away from room 301, she stopped to clean the doorway area. Room 303 was empty, no patient inside, But procedure was procedure, and Sadie still cleaned it every night, whether the room was occupied or not. She knelt down to wipe the baseboard near the gap of the door, one earbud in, the music dead because the battery had run out at some point without her noticing, and in that silence she felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, but a feeling. The feeling of being watched. Sadie knew that feeling. She'd grown up with it. Across 7 different foster homes, she'd learned that when the back of your neck went cold and the air in a room changed even though there was no wind, someone was watching you. And usually, that wasn't a good thing. She turned around, slowly, naturally, as if she were only changing the direction of the mop, and she saw it. Through the glass of room 301, about 6 meters away, dark gray eyes were looking straight at her. Rocco Valenti was awake. He was lying in bed, his head tilted slightly to the right, the breathing tube already removed and replaced by a nasal oxygen tube, and he was looking at her, not the passing glance of a groggy patient who had just woken up, not a harmless, curious look. This gaze had weight, had purpose, cold and penetrating. The gaze of a man used to reading people in a matter of seconds, assessing threat, calculating value, sorting friend from enemy, the way someone reads the bottom line of a balance sheet before deciding who gets kept and who gets erased. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't signal. He only looked, and that look said he knew who she was. Sadie stood still for 1 second. One unnaturally long second in which she didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't think. She only stood there, mop in her hand, oversized dark blue uniform hanging loose on her body, messy hair tied high, beneath the dim hallway lights, and looked back at the man through the glass. Then she lowered her head. She turned around, dipped the rag into the bucket, wrung it out, and kept mopping. She gradually moved out of room 301's line of sight, toward the elevator, each stroke steady, calm, as if nothing had happened. But her heart was beating faster. She could feel the pulse in her neck, at her temples, in the tips of the fingers gripping the mop handle. Not because she was afraid. Sadie had faced things far more frightening than a stare through glass. She'd faced her foster father's fists when she was 12, the streets of Chicago at midnight when she ran away at 16, Tommy's gray, pale face on a hospital bed when she was 23. No, her heart was beating faster for another reason. Because in 2 years of working at Lakewood, she had passed hundreds of people every night. Doctors, nurses, patients, guards, family members, and not one of them had ever seen her. She was the mop, the cart, the wet streak on the tile that dried after 10 minutes. She was air. But the man in room 301 had just looked at her as if she were the only person in the building, and Sadie didn't know what to do with that feeling. Inside the room, Rocco kept watching her shadow until it disappeared at the end of the hallway. Then he turned to Holt, who was sitting in the chair beside the bed after being called in from outside the door. "The janitor," Rocco said, his voice still hoarse, but every word clear as a line drawn on a map. "She saved me." Holt nodded, at least twice that I know of. Silence stretched for a long time. The monitor beeped steadily, the wall clock ticked, and beyond the window, Chicago lay beneath a thick layer of night clouds. Then Rocco asked. His voice was different. Holt had heard the boss's voice giving orders to kill men, orders to burn houses, orders to wipe out an entire chain of operations in one short sentence without a wasted word. But this was a voice Holt had never heard before. It wasn't a command. It was softer, slower, almost a real question. The kind of question asked by a man facing a problem for the first time that none of the formulas he knew could solve. Why? 2 days after the question Holt couldn't answer, somewhere in Chicago, a decision was made. The person behind it had tried twice, the first time with a switched IV bottle, subtle, clean, without a trace, but it failed. The second time with the HVAC technician, clever, logical, but that failed too. Both methods carried the style of someone used to controlling things from a distance, giving orders in a calm voice over the phone and letting other people dirty their hands. But now Rocco was awake. Every passing day was another day he grew stronger, more alert, and more dangerous. If Rocco recovered enough to start speaking to the loyal people who were still left out there, if he began pulling back the strings that had been cut, then the window of opportunity would slam shut forever. There was no more room for subtlety. A final solution was needed. Garrett Sinclair received the call on the afternoon of the 9th day. $750,000, half paid up front through an account in the Cayman Islands, the other half after completion. The target was a hospitalized patient, guarded by one bodyguard, in a private clinic in the northern suburbs of Chicago. Garrett didn't ask why. He never asked why. He asked only the 3 questions he always asked: floor plan, staff duty schedule, and the name listed on the medical equipment system. Garrett Sinclair was 43, and he looked like a middle manager at an insurance company in the suburbs. Pleasant face, neatly cut brown hair, polite smile, the kind of man you met at the supermarket and forgot before you even got home. That was exactly what made him dangerous. He specialized in handling targets in medical environments, hospitals, clinics, nursing homes, places where death happened every day, and no one suspected one more case. On the 10th night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Garrett stepped out of a gray sedan parked half a block from Lakewood's back gate. He wore a navy blue Medline technician uniform, tailored to fit. The Medline Industries logo embroidered on the left side of his chest, identical to the uniform real technicians wore when they came for monthly maintenance on infusion equipment. A fake badge was clipped to his breast pocket. False name, real photograph, scannable barcode, cloned from the badge of an actual Medline technician who was on leave in Michigan. In his hand was a standard black Medline plastic toolbox, and inside it were 3 things no technician carried: a syringe containing 50 milliequivalent potassium chloride, enough to stop a human heart in less than 10 seconds, a carbon fiber knife as thin as a razor blade hidden in the bottom compartment, and a Sig Sauer P365 fitted with a suppressor beneath a layer of false lining. Garrett entered through Lakewood's main gate and met the night security guard on the first floor. He handed over a fake work order, beautifully printed, with the Medline logo, a forged signature from the regional manager, and a note stating an urgent inspection of the Alaris infusion pump system under an FDA safety directive. The guard looked at the work order, looked at the badge, looked at the uniform, and nodded him through. Garrett stepped into the elevator and pressed for the 3rd floor. When the elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor, Sadie Langston was mopping the lobby. She was kneeling by the corner near the public hand-washing sink, scrubbing a stain from the border tile with a small brush, one earbud in. She heard the elevator doors and looked up. A man stepped out, navy blue Medline uniform, badge on his chest, black toolbox in his hand, walking with confident purpose toward the hallway leading to room 301. Sadie looked at him. 5 seconds. The uniform was right. She had seen Medline technicians wearing it every month when they came for maintenance. The badge was right, in the right place, clipped, in the right style. The toolbox was right. The same kind of black plastic case she had seen them carry every time. Then her eyes stopped at his shoes. Black leather shoes, polished bright, thick rubber soles, absolutely silent on the tile floor, not making a single sound as he walked. Sadie knew what Medline technicians' shoes looked like. She cleaned the mechanical room every week, and every time she had to sweep away the mud and machine oil streaks their steel-toe work boots left on the floor. Medline work boots were ugly, bulky, with obvious steel toes and hard soles that clacked loudly on tile. They weren't black leather shoes with tactical rubber soles, quiet as a cat. Sadie stood up, put the brush into her cart, and walked toward the security room at the opposite end of the hallway, with the calm air of someone going to get more clean water. Perry Dunn was sitting in the security room, eyes fixed on the camera screens. "Perry," Sadie said, her voice normal and gentle, letting no urgency show at all. "Is there Medline maintenance scheduled tonight? I need to know so I can plan when to clean the equipment room." Perry flipped open the logbook, running one finger down the lines. "No. The next Medline schedule is next Monday." Sadie's heart slammed hard, but her face didn't change. She nodded her thanks to Perry, stepped out of the security room, and walked straight to the 3rd floor nurses' station. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the nurses' station had only one nurse on duty, and she was in a patient's room on the 2nd floor. The desk was empty. Sadie stepped behind the counter, where she had cleaned every night for 2 years, where she knew the position of every pen, every logbook, every button. Her hand slid beneath the desktop, on the right side, just under the 2nd drawer, where a small red plastic button was recessed into the wood. The silent alarm, connected directly to the local police station, mandatory standard for every private medical facility in Illinois. Sadie knew the button was there because she wiped under this desk every night and had accidentally touched it for the first time 18 months earlier, bringing 2 police cars to Lakewood within 7 minutes and forcing Perry to explain for half an hour. She pressed the button. No sound, no flashing light, Nothing changed in the quiet hallway of the third floor. But at the police station, 6 minutes away by car, a signal had just lit up on the control panel. 6 minutes. Sadie looked toward the hallway. Garrett Sinclair was 15 steps from room 301. Garrett Sinclair stopped in front of the glass door of room 301 with his most polite smile. Holt Brennan was sitting outside, his back straighter than it had been on any other night, because the boss was awake, and Rocco's presence always made everyone around him stretch tight as a drawn wire. Holt looked up when he saw the figure approaching, his right hand sliding inside his jacket by reflex. "Hello," Garrett said, his voice professional, warm, neither fast nor slow, carrying the exact rhythm of a man used to speaking with hospital security staff. "Medline technician. We received an urgent alert from the FDA about a firmware error in the Alaris infusion pump model currently being used in this room. The error can cause incorrect pain medication dosing, and in the worst case, medication shock. I need to check and update it immediately." Holt frowned. "No one notified me." "This is an emergency directive from the FDA issued this afternoon," Garrett replied without the slightest hesitation. "All medical facilities using this Alaris 4 line have to update within 24 hours. You can call the doctor on duty to confirm, but every minute the system runs faulty firmware, your patient is at risk of receiving the wrong dose. And in his condition, the wrong dose of pain medication could cause respiratory arrest." Holt hesitated. He didn't understand what firmware was, didn't know which generation of Alaris 4 this was, and had no way to verify anything this man had just said at 2 o'clock in the morning, when Dr. Whitfield was asleep at home and the nurse on duty was downstairs. But the 3 words, respiratory arrest, struck his mind like a hammer. Over the past 10 days, Holt had seen Rocco come too close to dying too many times to risk one more just because he'd blocked a technician from checking the equipment. "Make it quick," Holt said, standing, shifting aside but not leaving the door completely. "I'll be right here." Garrett nodded and pushed open the glass door into room 301. The room was dark, lit only by the green, blinking glow of the monitor and the indicator light on the infusion pump. Rocco was sleeping, or had his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with his own breathing now, no longer completely dependent on the machine. Garrett stepped to the bedside, set the toolbox on the side table, and opened the lid. His right hand slid past the fake tools on top and touched the syringe hidden in the false compartment below. 50 milli equivalent of potassium chloride, clear, odorless, deadly. He pulled out the syringe, concealed it along his forearm, and moved toward the central venous line inserted near Rocco's collarbone. All he had to do was open the line cap, push the plunger, and walk out. Rocco's heart would stop within 10 seconds. By the time the alarm sounded, Garrett would be in the elevator. "Excuse me." Garrett froze. The voice came from the doorway, soft, calm, not hurried at all. He turned around. Standing on the threshold was the janitor. Oversized dark blue uniform, messy brown hair tied high, right hand holding a mop upright beside her body. Her dark brown eyes looked straight at Garrett without blinking. "I need to mop this room," Sadie said, her voice even, as if she were reading from a schedule. "My cleaning time is 2:15. You'll have to wait or come back later." Garrett frowned, his hand still hiding the syringe along his forearm. "I'm working, ma'am. Get out." Sadie didn't get out. She stepped into the room, pushing the steel mop cart in ahead of her, its wheels rolling heavily across the tile, and stopped it right in the only path to the door. Then she looked down at Garrett's hand. "You're holding a syringe," she said, her voice still calm, but every word was clear as a knife cut. "Medline technicians don't use syringes. They use laptops and USB cables to update firmware. I know because I clean the equipment room every week when they come, and I've never seen anyone bring a syringe to fix software." A deadly silence fell over room 301. The beeping of the monitor became the only sound, steady, indifferent, counting the rhythm of a confrontation where neither side stepped back. Garrett assessed quickly. Janitor, female, small, no more than 1.60 meters. No weapon except a mop, no threat. He had handled situations more complicated than this, in hospitals in Detroit and clinics in Miami. A night shift janitor wasn't on the list of things that worried Garrett Sinclair. He slipped the syringe into his breast pocket, and his right hand slid down to the toolbox, into the bottom compartment, and pulled out the carbon fiber knife. The thin blade glimmered beneath the monitor light. "You should turn away." Garrett said in a low voice, stepping toward Sadie. Sadie didn't turn away. She had been waiting for this moment since she pressed the silent alarm. She knew it was coming, and she knew the only things standing between that knife and the man in the hospital bed were her, the mop, and a 20-kilo steel cart full of dirty water. She clenched her teeth, threw her whole body weight against the mop cart, and shoved. The steel cart shot straight into Garrett's shin with enough force to knock him off balance. 20 kilos of dirty water plus a steel frame hitting shin bone made a heavy, dull sound. Garrett roared, his leg buckling, his hand slashing the knife through the air where Sadie had been standing 1 second earlier, but she had already stepped back out of reach. The syringe in his breast pocket flew out as he staggered, dropped to the floor, and rolled under the foot of the bed. And Sadie screamed, one single scream, tearing open the silence of the 3rd floor at 2 o'clock in the morning, echoing down the hallway all the way to the glass door where Holt was standing. "Holt!" Holt heard Sadie's scream and reacted with 10 years of bodyguard instinct. He kicked open the glass door of room 301, his right hand pulling the Glock from under his jacket in the same motion, his eyes sweeping the room for the threat. He saw Garrett staggering beside the bed, saw the knife in the man's hand, saw Sadie backing toward the wall. But Garrett Sinclair wasn't the amateur HVAC technician from the 6th night. Garrett was a man who had killed 14 targets in medical environments, without once leaving a trace. And when everything collapsed, he shifted to Plan B faster than anyone in the room could process. Garrett's left hand dropped the knife, slipped into the toolbox still open on the side table, and pulled the Sig Sauer P365 from the false lining, the suppressor already attached. One single movement, smooth as water, and before Holt could aim the Glock at the target, the suppressed gunshot sounded. It wasn't an explosion, but a damp, heavy tear through the air, like a book falling onto carpet. The 9mm bullet tore through Holt's right shoulder. He twisted, his back hitting the glass door frame, his knees buckling, and the Glock flew from his hand, sliding across the tile floor into the hallway, more than 2 meters from the door. Holt collapsed at the foot of the wall, his left hand clutching his right shoulder, dark blood beginning to seep between his fingers. Garrett turned the gun toward Sadie. She was standing against the left wall, trapped between the mop cart and the IV stand, with no path to run, no weapon in her hand, and less than 3 meters between her and the suppressed barrel. "Biggest mistake of your life, Janitor," Garrett said, his voice not even breathless, calm as if he were commenting on the weather. Sadie didn't stand still. She didn't have time to stand still. Her hand grabbed the stainless steel splash guard attached to the side of the mop cart, the thin shield used to keep water from spraying when she wrung out the mop, and she pulled it up in front of her chest, like a makeshift shield. At the same time, her right foot kicked hard into the 20-liter bucket of water sitting on the lower rack of the cart. The bucket tipped over, and cloudy, dirty water burst across the linoleum floor like a broken dam, spreading fast through the room, turning the polished, smooth floor into slick ice. Garrett fired. The bullet pierced the thin, stainless steel, deflected just enough to miss Sadie by less than a handspan, and buried itself straight into the monitor screen behind her. The screen exploded, plastic and glass spraying everywhere, and instantly the alarm system in room 301 erupted, shrieking, screaming in repeated bursts, red lights flashing wildly across every piece of equipment in the room. Garrett stepped forward to get a clearer angle, and his right foot came down on the wet floor. The black leather tactical rubber soles, perfectly silent on dry tile, suddenly became his greatest enemy on the layer of dirty, soapy water. His foot slipped, his center of gravity broke, and Garrett pitched forward for a split second, the barrel of the gun dipping. That split second was all Sadie needed. She swung the aluminum mop handle, more than 1 meter long, heavy and hard, across Garrett's right wrist, the hand holding the gun. Aluminum met wrist bone with a dry, sharp crack. Garrett's fingers opened by reflex, and the Sig Sauer flew from his hand, skidding across the wet floor, spinning until it struck the foot of the medicine cabinet on the opposite side. Garrett roared, not from pain but from rage, and his left hand snatched the carbon fiber knife from the floor where he had dropped it earlier. The thin blade glimmered beneath the flashing red alarm lights. He lunged at Sadie, his feet sliding on the wet floor but his trained body using momentum to keep its balance, the knife slashing sideways at chest height. Sadie backed into the corner, her spine touching the wall, with nowhere left to retreat. Her eyes swept quickly through the flashing red light and the endless scream of the alarm. Her hand reached under the bed, to the place where she had knelt and cleaned every night for 2 years, the place where she knew what was attached to the lower crossbar because she had touched it hundreds of times while scrubbing the floor. Backup oxygen tank. Blue aluminum. 7 kilos. Clipped to the lower rail under the bed with a Velcro strap. Sadie yanked the strap free, and the tank dropped into her hands. Heavy, solid, cold. Garrett rushed in, knife raised high. Sadie swung the oxygen tank upward with both hands, putting the full weight of her 54-kilo body into that one strike. The bottom of the aluminum tank smashed straight into Garrett's right knee. The sound of the break was clear, sharp, dry, like snapping a dead branch in the middle of winter. Garrett screamed. His right leg folding backward at an angle the human knee was never designed to fold, and he crashed onto the wet floor, his back slamming against the side of the hospital bed, the knife falling from his hand for the second time. But Garrett Sinclair wasn't a man who quit because of a broken knee. $750,000 didn't allow him to quit. Lying on the floor, his right leg crushed beneath him, he rolled over, and his eyes found what he needed. The syringe. The potassium chloride syringe that had flown from his breast pocket earlier was still lying under the foot of the bed, less than 1 meter from his hand. Garrett began to crawl, dragging his body across the wet floor with both arms, ignoring the broken knee trailing behind him, his fingers reaching for the syringe. He didn't need the gun, didn't need the knife. He only needed that poison to touch Rocco Valenti's foreline. 10 seconds. That was all. Sadie saw all 3 things at once. The syringe lying beneath the foot of the bed, Garrett crawling toward it with the madness of a man who needed only 1 more meter to finish a $750,000 contract. And in the right corner of the room, half hidden in the red flicker of the alarm lights, the crash cart. A mobile emergency cart. Mandatory standard in every VIP patient room, with a defibrillator already mounted on it, and 2 paddles resting in their holders. Sadie knew that machine, not because she'd been trained, not because anyone had taught her. She knew because she had stood mopping the floor in room 301 on enough nights to witness what happened when the alarm went off, and the nursing team rushed in. She had seen them pull the paddles from their holders, press the button, wait for the whine, press them to a patient's chest, and shout clear before releasing the shock. She had seen it at least 3 times in 2 years. Those code blue moments when she stood outside the door holding her mop, waiting to clean the room after everything was over. She wasn't a nurse, but she had eyes that knew how to watch, and a memory that knew how to hold. Sadie lunged toward the crash cart. Her hands yanked the 2 paddles from their holders. Her right thumb found the charge button on the paddle handle and pressed it. The small screen on the machine lit up. The number climbed fast, and the whine began. Low at first, then higher, higher, like the sound of some enormous mosquito drawing closer. 360 joules. On the wet floor, Garrett had crawled to the syringe. His fingers touched the plastic barrel, closed around it, gripped tight. He rolled onto his back, his left hand raising the syringe. His right hand braced against the floor as he tried to lift his body toward the hospital bed where Rocco's foreline was still connected. His shattered right knee wouldn't let him stand, but it couldn't stop him from moving forward. Garrett looked at Sadie, holding the 2 defibrillator paddles, and a twisted smile dragged itself across his face. The smile of a man who had killed enough people to know that a janitor holding medical equipment wasn't a threat. Game over, Garrett said through teeth clenched against the pain, his eyes still locked on the IV line at Rocco's neck. Sadie looked at him. The whine of the defibrillator had reached its peak, steady, high, ready. She whispered, her voice so soft it was almost only breath, the single word she had heard nurses say every time before pressing the button. Clear. She lunged forward, dropped to her knees, and pressed both paddles straight against Garrett's chest. His navy blue Medline uniform was soaked with sweat, drenched, a perfect conductor. 360 joules of current discharged straight into Garrett Sinclair's body. The effect happened instantly. The human body runs on electrical signals, and when 360 joules tear through the nervous system all at once, every signal short-circuits. Garrett's back arched off the floor, rigid, his muscles convulsing out of control. The syringe flew from his hand for the second time and the last time. His eyes rolled white, his mouth opened, but no sound came out except a strangled wheeze. Then he collapsed, his head striking the wet floor, his body loose, limp, motionless. The smell of scorched fabric rose from where the paddles had touched his chest, mixing with the sharp, cold scent of ozone coming from the defibrillator. Room 301 reeked of a battlefield. Sadie didn't stop to check whether Garrett was still breathing. She dropped the paddles, kicked the Sig Sauer on the floor so it slid under the medicine cabinet and out of reach, then bent down, picked up the potassium chloride syringe, and shoved it deep into the pocket of her uniform pants. Then she looked up at the hospital bed, and her heart dropped into her stomach. In the chaos, Rocco's nasal oxygen tubing had been pulled out of place. The small replacement monitor mounted at the head of the bed, the only one that hadn't been destroyed, was flashing red, and his SpO2 reading was falling. 92, 88, 85. Sadie ran to the head of the bed, her eyes scanning fast for the ambu bag, the manual resuscitation bag she had seen nurses use during every code blue, always hanging at the head of the bed in the emergency kit mounted on the wall. She snatched the ambu bag down, connected it to the airway, and began to squeeze. Steady rhythm, slow, press down and release, press and release, pumping oxygen into Rocco's lungs by hand, while around her lay broken glass, dirty water, Holt's blood, and the unconscious body of a professional assassin. The SpO2 stopped falling at 83, trembled, then began to climb again. 85, 88, 91. Sadie squeezed, released, squeezed, released, and on the fourth or fifth squeeze, she felt that gaze again. She looked down. Rocco Valenti had opened his eyes. Not the vague, half-open flicker from the sixth night. Fully open, fully awake. His dark gray eyes looked straight up into her face, and Sadie knew, from the way that gaze didn't blink, didn't move away, that he had been awake longer than she thought. He had seen everything. The small woman in the soaked, dark blue janitor's uniform, messy hair coming loose, bruised hands gripping the ambu bag, standing in the middle of the ruined room. She had turned into a battlefield with a bucket of water and a mop. Her body was shaking, from shoulders down to arms, from arms down to fingers. She was trembling beyond control, because the adrenaline was draining away, and her 54-kilogram body was paying the price for everything that had just happened. But her eyes didn't shake. Her dark brown eyes looked down at him, still calm, still quiet, still the eyes of someone who had decided that the man in this bed would live, and no one, no knife, no bullet, no syringe, would be allowed to change that decision. Rocco Valenti, 36 years old, the boss who controlled half of Chicago's underworld, a man who had never owed anyone anything because he always paid in money or in blood, lay in that bed looking at the janitor, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't find a single word to say. The elevator bell rang at the end of the third-floor hallway. Inside room 301, amid the alarm still shrieking without pause and the smell of ozone still lingering in the air, Sadie heard that sound, and her instincts clenched tight. She lifted her head and looked through the glass wall of the patient room, through the dirty water and the blood smeared across the glass, and she saw 3 figures step out of the main elevator. The man in front was almost 60 years old, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit, his silver-white hair combed neatly back, his spine straight, his steps slow, carrying the authority of a man used to having an entire room rise when he entered. Behind him were 2 younger men, both in black suits, both with their right hands hidden inside their jackets, both moving with long strides. Carlo Valenti walked down the third-floor hallway, as if he were walking through his own home. Not hurried, not slow, his pace even, his face calm. When he reached room 301, he stopped and looked in through the glass. He saw the floor flooded with dirty water, saw shards of the monitor scattered everywhere, saw Garrett Sinclair lying unconscious on the floor, the chest of his shirt scorched, his right leg bent at an unnatural angle, and his face didn't change. No surprise, no panic, no anger, only a slight narrowing of the eyes, the kind of narrowing from a chess player who has just lost a piece he hadn't planned to lose. Irritated, but not enough to alter his strategy, Sadie looked at him through the glass, her right hand still squeezing the ambu bag steadily for Rocco, and she didn't recognize the silver-haired man. She had never met Carlo Valenti. But on the floor, leaning against the base of the wall beside the doorframe, Holt Brennan looked up. Blood from his right shoulder was still flowing through the fingers of his left hand as he pressed down on the wound, his face white as paper from blood loss, but his eyes were still working. And when his eyes recognized the 2 men walking behind Carlo, every piece fell into place with a crash only Holt could hear inside his own head. Frank Morello. Holt knew Frank. Holt knew Frank was the man assigned to control communication between Rocco and the rest of the Empire, while Rocco was hospitalized. Frank was the man who should have been making calls, should have been sending people in, should have been keeping the Empire running while the boss recovered. but Frank had done nothing. And now Frank was standing beside Carlo, hand hidden inside his jacket, arriving at the boss's hospital room at 2 o'clock in the morning, right after the assassin had been taken down. Everything fit. The calm voice on the phone the first night, the absolute silence of the Empire for 10 days, the switched IV bottle, the HVAC technician, Garrett Sinclair. All of it began with one person, the only person who knew where Rocco was, which room he was in, who was guarding him, and the staff schedule. The person who had ordered Rocco transferred to Lakewood because Holt himself had called him on the first night. "Close the door," Holt said, his voice trembling from blood loss, but every word as clear as the final order of a soldier who knows he is about to fall. "Lock the room. Now." He's the one who sold out the boss. Sadie didn't ask who, didn't ask why. 10 days in the dark had taught her to trust instinct, and instinct was screaming now that the 3 men beyond the glass hadn't come to help. Her left hand reached out, stretching her body while her right hand kept the ambu bag sealed over Rocco's face, and her fingers touched the red plastic button mounted on the wall beside the head of the bed, the magnetic lock button for the isolation room, and she slammed it hard. A heavy metallic impact rang through the room as the magnetic lock mechanism activated. The glass door of room 301 slammed shut and sealed. Outside, Carlo Valenti stopped. He stood less than 2 meters from the glass door, close enough for Sadie to see the stitching on the lapel of his gray suit, close enough for her to see his eyes, paler gray than Rocco's, colder and completely empty. Carlo looked into the room, looked at Garrett on the floor, looked at Holt bleeding at the base of the wall, looked at the janitor squeezing an ambu bag beside his nephew's bed. Then he raised his hand and pressed the intercom button mounted outside the glass doorframe. "Girl." Carlo's voice was deep, warm, calm, flowing through the intercom speaker into the room like honey poured across a tabletop. "I'm Carlo Valenti, Rocco's uncle. I understand you're scared, but you have nothing to do with this. You're only cleaning staff. Open the door, walk out, go home, and forget everything about tonight. No one will touch you. I promise." Sadie didn't speak. She didn't look at Carlo. She looked down at Rocco's face and squeezed the ambu bag. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. A steady rhythm, slow, unwavering, the breath she was holding in place for the man beneath her hands. On the bed, Rocco Valenti opened his eyes. He turned his head to the left, slowly, painfully, and looked through the glass. He saw Carlo, the face he had looked at for all 36 years of his life, the face that had held him on the day of his father's funeral, had stood beside him in front of the coffin when he was 11 years old, and the world collapsed for the first time, had bent down to speak into his ear in the same deep, warm voice now coming from the intercom, saying, "I'll always be by your side, Rocco, I promise." 25 years ago, Carlo had promised, and 10 days ago, Carlo had stood in the warehouse and watched his nephew take 3 bullets without lifting a finger. Rocco looked at Carlo through glass streaked with blood and dirty water. Dark gray eyes met pale gray eyes, and Rocco asked, his voice only a breath through the oxygen tube, one single word. But inside it were 25 years of trust, 10 days of betrayal, and an entire empire collapsing. Why? Carlo looked at his nephew through the glass. His face didn't change. No remorse, no explanation. Not even a flicker of the uncle who had held an 11-year-old boy on the day of a funeral. He didn't answer. He turned to Frank Morello, his voice flat as the surface of a frozen lake. "Break the door." Sadie heard the 2 words, "break the door," flow through the intercom speaker. And she knew she had about 20 seconds. The glass door of Lakewood's VIP isolation room was tempered glass. Thick, more impact-resistant than regular glass. But it wasn't bulletproof. 3 to 4 shots into the same spot, and it would shatter. 20 seconds. She had survived 7 foster homes, the streets of Chicago at 16, Tommy's death, a professional assassin with a knife and a gun. 20 seconds was enough. The first thing she did was release the ambu bag from Rocco's face and snatch the roll of medical tape from the instrument tray on the bedside table. She taped the ambu bag to Rocco's face with 3 quick wraps around his head, securing the breathing bag to the nasal oxygen tube. Then her hand reached up to the wall at the head of the bed, where the oxygen adjustment valve was mounted on the medical gas panel. She twisted the valve fully open, past 15 liters per minute, letting high-flow oxygen pour by itself into the ambu bag and into Rocco's lungs without her needing to squeeze it by hand anymore. 15 seconds. Sadie turned to her mop cart, the only loyal steel companion that had stayed with her for 2 years. She opened the cap of the industrial floor-cleaning chemical attached to the side of the cart, a 5-liter plastic bottle with a yellow label printed in black letters. Ammonia concentrate, the cleaner she diluted every night to mop the hallway floors and bathrooms. She didn't dilute it. She poured the entire bottle onto the floor in front of the glass door. 5 liters of concentrated ammonia spreading across the tile, its sharp, choking stench rising instantly, burning the nose, burning the eyes, strong enough to make Sadie hold her breath as she stepped through the chemical puddle. 10 seconds. She turned back to the underside of the bed, where the second backup oxygen tank was still fastened to the lower rail. She had used the first tank to smash Garrett's knee. The second one was still intact. She yanked the strap free, pulled the tank out, grabbed the medical tape scissors from the instrument tray, and cut the rubber tube attached to the valve, leaving the valve mouth open. She twisted the valve all the way open, and pure oxygen blasted from the valve mouth under high pressure, sending out an icy stream of air, white mist rising as the oxygen met the moisture in the room. She rolled the tank toward the door, leaving it on the floor with the valve mouth aimed at the threshold, spraying thick white fog that mixed with the ammonia fumes and turned into a blinding cloud of chemical air. 5 seconds. Sadie looked around the room one last time. Her eyes stopped on the surgical tray on the side table beside the crash cart, where there was a bottle of isopropyl alcohol used to disinfect instruments. She snatched the bottle, ran toward the door, and smashed it at the glass threshold. The glass broke. Alcohol splashed across the tile floor, mixing with the ammonia and water. The razor-sharp smell of alcohol blending with the acrid stench into air. No one could breathe without choking. Isopropyl alcohol, flammable, and pure oxygen was spraying right beside it. Outside the glass door, Frank Morello had drawn his gun. He stepped back 2 paces, aimed straight at the center of the glass, and fired. The first shot, the glass cracked, the fracture lines spreading from the bullet's strike like a spider web. The second shot, the spider web widened, and pieces of glass began breaking loose from the edge. The third shot, the glass shattered. The entire sheet of tempered glass collapsed inward, breaking into thousands of small, blunt-edged square fragments scattered across the floor, and the threshold of room 301 opened wide. Frank stepped in immediately, gun raised level with his face, finger on the trigger, eyes sweeping the room for a target, and his lungs drew breath. The concentrated ammonia attacked the lining of Frank's nose and eyes like acid. He coughed violently, his eyes burning so badly his eyelids clamped shut by reflex and wouldn't open, tears pouring out, his nose searing, his lungs spasming. He staggered backward, the gun in his hand dipping, because he could see nothing except tears and white fog. Reggie Slade followed him into the doorway and met the same wall of ammonia and freezing oxygen straight in the face. He coughed, backed away, one hand clamped over his nose and mouth. Both men wavered in the broken threshold, blinded, choking, lost inside the thick white mist. Sadie had already turned back to the crash cart. She ripped the defibrillator paddles free for the second time that night, pressed charge, the familiar whine climbing higher and higher, and when the machine peaked, she threw both paddles across the wet floor toward the doorway. The 2 metal conductors slid across the wet tile and shot into the puddle of isopropyl alcohol right at the threshold. Sparks leaped when the metal faces of the paddles struck the steel doorframe. The alcohol caught fire. A blue-orange flame burst from the puddle, low, hot, racing quickly along the doorway. The pure oxygen spraying from the tank beside it fed the flames like wind blowing into a furnace. The fire surged, almost half a meter high, forming a wall of flame across the entrance to room 301. Frank screamed as the fire licked at his pant leg. He staggered back into the hallway, slapping at the fabric catching fire. Reggie ran. Carlo Valenti stood 3 meters from the door, watching a wall of fire rise inside the quiet suburban Chicago private clinic hallway, and for the first time that night, his face changed. On the ceiling of room 301, the heat sensor in the sprinkler system detected the sudden spike in temperature. With a dry, clean mechanical clack, the sprinkler head activated. Cold water poured from the ceiling, drenching everything in the room, the floor, the bed, Sadie, Rocco, Garrett still unconscious on the ground. The fire met water, sputtered, then died, but thick black smoke from the burning alcohol and melting plastic still rolled through the hallway, turning the 3rd floor into a blind maze. Then came the boots, heavy, fast, many of them, echoing from the stairwell and the elevator at the same time. Not the stealthy steps of assassins, not the calm stride of a crime boss. This was the pounding of 12 pairs of tactical boots, striking the tile floor in the same rhythm. Chicago PD SWAT. Drop your weapons. Hands up. Get down. Tactical flashlights cut through the black smoke. Carlo Valenti was shoved against the wall by 2 officers, his hands twisted behind his back, steel cuffs locking shut with a sharp click. Frank Morello lay face down on the hallway floor, his cheek pressed to wet tile, his hands cuffed behind his back, his pant leg still smoking. Reggie Slade was stopped at the elevator, on his knees, hands on his head. Garrett Sinclair was placed on a stretcher by SWAT medics, still unconscious, still smelling of scorched fabric across his chest. Inside room 301, sprinkler water still dripped from the ceiling. Sadie Langston stood beside Rocco's bed, soaked from head to toe, her dark blue uniform torn at the shoulder and elbow, brown hair plastered to her forehead, hands bruised and scraped, standing among broken glass and dirty water and black smoke, and she looked down at the monitor screen. Heart rate 74. SpO2, 96%. Rocco Valenti was alive. A SWAT officer stepped into the room through the doorway where the glass was gone, looked at the scene, looked at Sadie, looked at the janitor's uniform, and asked, "Are you hurt? We need to take you downstairs and have you checked." Sadie looked around the room. Broken glass, standing water, spreading smoke, blood on the wall, the smells of ammonia and ozone and burned alcohol tangled together into something no one would ever want to breathe. Then she looked back at the officer, her voice even, calm, the voice of a person used to cleaning up the mess other people left behind. "I'm fine, but someone needs to call maintenance to replace this glass, and I need a clean bucket of water. This floor is filthy." The week after that night, room 301 was repaired. New glass was installed, the floor was cleaned, the monitor was replaced, the crash cart was fully restocked, but the bullet mark in the wall still left a dent beneath the fresh coat of paint, as if the room itself wanted to keep proof of what had happened. Rocco Valenti recovered faster than anyone expected, including Dr. Whitfield. He could sit up now, could eat solid food, could speak without a breathing tube, and his dark gray eyes had regained the familiar coldness Holt recognized at once as the eyes of the boss, no longer the eyes of a patient. And as if by some dark magic, the moment news spread through Chicago that Rocco was awake and Carlo had been arrested, the old faces began to appear. The third-floor hallway at Lakewood suddenly became more crowded than ever. Other captains and low-level capos who had remained hiding in the shadows came to kneel, literally. They came begging to serve, swearing loyalty all over again, explaining that Carlo and Frank had forced them or kept them in the dark, that they hadn't known, that they had always believed the boss would return. Rocco accepted none of them. He lay in bed, listened to each man, his face expressionless, then gave Holt a nod to have them escorted out, one after another. After the 7th capo left, Holt asked quietly, "Who does boss want to see?" Rocco looked through the glass door, where the third-floor hallway lay silent beneath the night lights. "The janitor," he said. It took Holt 20 minutes to find Sadie, not because she was hiding, but because she was where she always was, in the basement, cleaning the laundry area, a place no one ever came looking. Sadie came up to the 3rd floor, still wearing her dark blue uniform, still holding her mop upright beside her, still wearing the white sneakers worn down at the heels until they were almost flat. She stood at the door of room 301, the new glass door closed, and looked in. Rocco was sitting propped up in bed, pillows behind his back, his right hand still connected to an IV line. He looked at her. She looked at him. He pointed to the chair beside the bed, the chair Holt had sat in for 10 days. Sadie didn't sit. She stood at the door, her right hand gripping the mop handle, her shoulders slightly drawn inward, as if she were ready to turn away at any moment. Silence stretched. Rocco broke it. Why? It was the 3rd time he had asked that question. The first time, he had asked Holt after waking up and found no answer. The second time, he had asked Carlo through the glass and received only silence. The 3rd time, he asked the janitor who had saved his life at least 3 times that he knew of, and this was the first time he was asking the right person. Sadie was silent for a long time, long enough for the monitor to count 10 beats, 15 beats, 20 beats. Then she spoke, her voice soft, not looking into Rocco's eyes but down at the tile floor she had cleaned hundreds of nights. "Because there was someone I couldn't save once, and I swore to myself I'd never let that happen again, no matter who that person was." Rocco looked at her, His voice carried no emotion when he asked the next question. Flat, controlled, but his eyes did. Deep inside those dark gray eyes, something flickered that Sadie didn't recognize, or wasn't ready to recognize. Even if that person is a monster? Sadie lifted her head. For the first time, she looked straight into his eyes, without lowering her gaze, without avoiding him, without stepping back. I don't decide who's a monster, she said. I only decide who gets to live. Then she turned, pushed her mop cart into the hallway, and disappeared toward the service elevator. Rocco watched her until her shadow vanished at the end of the corridor. Then he called Holt in. Find everything about her, he said, and this time his voice wasn't cold. There was something in it Holt couldn't define, but it unsettled him, because in 10 years of serving as Rocco Valenti's bodyguard, he had never heard that tone in the boss's voice. Holt took 2 days. The file he brought back was so thin it was almost insulting. A 27-year life summarized in only a few sheets of paper. Illinois foster care from the age of 9, 7 foster homes, 3 of them with abuse records. Ran away at 16. Lived with her younger brother Tommy in a basement studio in Humboldt Park. Many jobs: dishwasher, housekeeper, kitchen assistant. Tommy died when Sadie was 23. Chronic kidney failure. Not enough money for a transplant. After that came Lakewood. Night shift janitor. $14.50 an hour. Her current address was still the Humboldt Park studio, 300 square feet. No debt, because no credit institution would approve her for a loan. No assets. No health insurance beyond the mandatory minimum. No living relatives. Rocco read the file in room 301 beneath the white ceiling lights, and every line struck him with a weight that 3 bullets had failed to deliver. She had nothing. No money to buy loyalty. No power to force obedience. No connection to trade. No reason to risk her life for a man she had never spoken to before the 10th night. And yet she had fought for him with a bucket of water and a mop more fiercely than anyone in the Valenti Empire had ever sworn blood loyalty. 3 nights after their first meeting, Sadie was mopping the 3rd-floor hallway near midnight when she heard Rocco's voice carrying through the glass door of room 301. The new glass door was thicker than the old one, but it wasn't completely soundproof. And in the midnight silence of Lakewood, the voice from inside the room came through as clearly as a radio turned low. Rocco was on the phone. Sadie wasn't trying to listen. She was only mopping the stretch of floor in front of room 301, the way she did every night, but she heard it. Rocco's voice was cold, sharp, slow, each word falling heavy as stone, a voice she had never heard in the times he had spoken to her or to Holt. This was a different voice. The voice of the boss. He was giving orders to someone on the other end about a subordinate who had followed Carlo and was now trying to run from Chicago. He used 2 words Sadie didn't need to be part of his world to understand. Handle him. Not find him. Not bring him back. Handle him. Sadie stopped mopping. She stood in the middle of the hallway, her hand wrapped around the mop handle, water dripping from the rag onto the tile. And for the first time since the night she had switched the IV bottle, she saw Rocco Valenti clearly, not through hospital glass, not through the frail breathing of a comatose patient, not through the exhausted eyes of a man who had just escaped death. She saw him through his voice, and that voice told her the truth she had been trying not to think about for more than 10 days. The man she had saved 3 times wasn't a victim. He was the kind of man who created victims. He was the kind of man who controlled, ordered, decided who lived and who died with a phone call at midnight. He was the kind of man whose world had crushed people like her, like Tommy, like every child who grew up in foster care, because their parents had been dragged into the spiral of drugs and violence that men like Rocco Valenti profited from. Sadie didn't step into room 301 that night. She turned her mop cart around, went back down the hallway, cleaned room 303, room 302, cleaned the lobby, cleaned the restroom, then went down to the 2nd floor, the 1st floor, the basement. She cleaned every place in Lakewood that night, except room 301. Inside the room, Rocco lay in the darkness after ending the call. He heard the mop cart roll past his door at 12:10, the familiar rhythm of its wheels, a rhythm he had begun to recognize over the past 10 days. Her rhythm, slow, steady, gentle. But the cart didn't stop. It passed by. The sound of the wheels grew farther away, fading at the end of the hallway, then disappeared. She didn't come in. Rocco lay there listening to the silence that replaced the sound of the mop cart. And he knew why. He didn't need Holt to explain, Didn't need security cameras. Didn't need a report. She had heard the phone call. She had heard him order a human life handled in a voice colder than the one he used to ask for coffee. And she had decided she didn't want to mop the floor of a room belonging to that kind of man anymore. Rocco stared up at the ceiling in the dark and felt something he didn't recognize right away because he had never felt it before. Not anger, not irritation, not the sting of wounded pride he knew so well whenever someone dared refuse him. This was something else, deeper, heavier, right in the center of his chest, in the place 3 bullets hadn't reached, but the silence of the janitor just had. Shame. Rocco Valenti, 36 years old, a man who had ordered killings without blinking, a man who had looked into enemies' eyes as they died and felt nothing, was lying in the dark feeling ashamed because a janitor had chosen not to mop the floor of his room. For 3 nights, Sadie didn't come. For 3 nights, Rocco lay listening to the mop cart roll past his door without stopping, and each night the thing in his chest grew a little heavier. On the 4th night, Sadie came back. She pushed open the glass door of room 301 without saying a word, without looking at Rocco, her eyes fixed on the floor, and began to mop. Rocco said nothing. He lay still, watching her clean, listening to the rag drag across the tile, listening to her even breathing, listening to water dripping from the mop into the bucket. The silence stretched for 20 minutes, long enough for Sadie to finish half the room and turn back toward the bed. Then Rocco spoke. "Your brother, Tommy, I know what happened." Sadie stopped mopping. Her whole body froze, her hand still gripping the mop handle, her back turned to the bed. She didn't turn around, but Rocco could see her knuckles whitening around the aluminum handle. "Don't." Her voice was small but sharp. "Don't use my brother to manipulate me. I know who you are. I know what you do. Don't turn Tommy into a tool." "I'm not manipulating you." Rocco's voice was slow, soft, and there was something in it even he wasn't used to. Because this was the first time in 36 years that he had said a sentence with no purpose behind it, no calculation, no strategy, no desire to get anything from the person listening. "I'm sorry. About Tommy. About the world men like me created. The world women like you had to suffer through." Sadie stood motionless. Then her shoulders trembled. Slightly, almost invisibly, but in the quiet room where there was only the monitor's beep and the breathing of 2 people, Rocco saw it. Then she turned around. Her eyes were wet. Tears ran down her cheeks, fell from her chin, and dotted the dark blue of her uniform. She wasn't crying because of Rocco. She wasn't crying because of his apology. She was crying because in the 4 years since Tommy had died in her arms in the emergency room of a public hospital, not one person in this world had said Tommy's name unless it was her. For 4 years, she had carried that name alone, in her head, in her chest, in her dreams, and there had been no one to share it with. And now a mafia boss lying in a hospital bed had just said her brother's name. And even though she knew he was a monster, even though she knew his world was the world that had killed Tommy in an indirect way no court could ever charge, having someone say Tommy's name still made her cry. She didn't forgive Rocco. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she didn't walk out of the room. She stood there, tears on her cheeks, her hand around the mop handle, and she stayed. To Rocco Valenti, a man everyone in the world either feared or ran from, a janitor standing in his hospital room crying without leaving, was more than anything he had ever been given in his entire life. 6 months after that night, Carlo Valenti stood before the federal court of the Northern District of Illinois in an orange prison uniform instead of the gray suit he had once worn like armor. 17 charges under the RICO Act, including conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, money laundering, and operating a criminal organization. The jury took less than 4 hours to reach a verdict, guilty on all 17 counts. Carlo Valenti would die in federal prison, and the promise, "I'll always be by your side," finally became the most honest sentence of his life. Only he was by Rocco's side in a way no one would ever have wanted. The Valenti empire didn't collapse. It changed, slowly, painfully, like a man learning how to walk again after taking 3 bullets to the chest. Rocco didn't become a saint overnight. He was still cold, still controlling, still the kind of man who could walk into a room and make the whole room go silent. But he began taking the first steps that, 6 months earlier, he would have called weakness. The restaurant chain in downtown Chicago gradually shifted into fully legal operations. The illegal logistics division shrank, replaced by commercial transportation contracts. And one March morning, On the desk of the director of the pediatric transplant program at Chicago Children's Hospital, an unnamed envelope appeared. Inside was a check from an anonymous medical fund, enough to cover the entire cost of kidney transplants for 3 poor children on the waiting list. No sender's name, no conditions, no demands. Holt knew where the money came from. Rocco never told Sadie. Sadie Langston was no longer a janitor, not because Rocco had pulled her out of that job. He had offered, and she had refused him outright with the sentence, "I don't take money from someone I haven't decided whether to trust." It was because Lakewood's board of directors, after the internal report about that night was completed, offered her the night shift manager position, with double the pay, full health insurance, and a schedule that allowed her to attend school during the day. Sadie enrolled in the nursing program at City Colleges of Chicago that fall, a dream she had never dared to imagine when she was still making $14.50 an hour just to pay rent. Every Saturday, Rocco Valenti drove to the 300-square-foot studio in Humboldt Park. He parked the black sedan at the curb, walked down the narrow stairs to the basement level, knocked on the door, and sat down in the only folding chair in the room. The room was so small that Rocco could stand in the middle and touch both opposite walls with his hands. Nothing in that room belonged to him. No painting he had chosen, no piece of furniture he had bought, no corner he controlled. The coffee Sadie made for him was cheap coffee from an old machine she had bought at a garage sale, and it was the best coffee Rocco Valenti had ever tasted in his life. Not because of the flavor, but because it was the first cup of coffee anyone had ever made for him, without fear and without wanting something from him. One night in late August, inside that studio, Sadie was sitting on the bed studying, an anatomy textbook open on her lap, the small desk lamp casting yellow light across the page. Rocco sat in the folding chair beside the window, reading a book. Sadie had forced him to read, starting with simple books, because she had told him straight to his face in a voice no one in the Valenti Empire would have dared to use. "A leader who doesn't read is just a thug who knows how to wear a suit." Rocco didn't argue. He started reading. The room was quiet, with only the sound of pages turning and the soft rain outside the basement window. Then Sadie looked up. "That night," she said, her voice soft, her eyes still on the page, "in room 301, when I used the defibrillator, my hands were shaking." Rocco set the book down. "I know," he said. "I was awake. I saw, but I still did it." "You're the bravest person I've ever met," Rocco said, his voice slow and gentle in a way that, 6 months earlier, he hadn't known he was capable of speaking. "And I've met a lot of people holding guns." Sadie looked down at her own hands. Small hands, thin hands, calloused from mop handles, scarred by cleaning chemicals, hands that had squeezed an ambu bag to keep him breathing, had swung an oxygen tank hard enough to break an assassin's knee, had pressed defibrillator paddles to a killer's chest. Then she looked at Rocco's hands, resting on the book, large hands, scars across the knuckles, hands that had ordered, controlled, crushed, and were now learning to turn pages instead of overturning negotiation tables. Rocco slowly reached out and took her hand. Not naturally, not smoothly, because Rocco Valenti had never learned how to touch anyone without threatening or controlling them. His hand closed around her calloused one gently, awkwardly, like a man holding something for the first time that he knew he didn't deserve to keep, but still didn't want to let go. Sadie looked at their 2 hands, then said, her voice soft and calm, the voice of the night shift janitor who had mopped millions of floor tiles and never complained. "My hands still shake. Every night, but I still mop the floor, because it's what needs to be done." Outside the basement window of the Humboldt Park studio, Chicago rain fell steadily on the sidewalk, just like the first night when Rocco Valenti had been carried through Lakewood's back door with 3 bullets in his chest. But this time, he wasn't bleeding. This time, he was sitting in a folding chair, drinking cheap coffee, reading a book, beside the woman who had saved his life with a bucket of water and a mop, and for the first time in all 36 years of his life, Rocco Valenti felt at peace. Sadie and Rocco's story reminds us that no one in this world is invisible. The woman the whole world walked past every day without looking back was the very person who fought the fiercest when a human life was placed on the scale. Sometimes courage doesn't come from guns or power. It comes from an ordinary person deciding that they won't walk away when someone needs them to stay. And sometimes the greatest change in a person's life doesn't begin with a grand victory, but with one small moment when they feel ashamed of themselves. This story also reminds us to respect every person around us, no matter who they are or what kind of work they do, because you never know how brave a heart may be inside the quiet person mopping the floor at midnight. If this story touched you, please like it and share it with someone you love, so they'll know that sometimes real heroes don't wear armor, they wear janitor uniforms. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so we can listen together to more deeply moving stories every day. We'd love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever met an ordinary but extraordinary person in your everyday life? Have you ever been the person others overlooked, but still chose to stay when everyone else walked away? Share your story and your thoughts in the comments below. We read every comment, and we'd truly love to hear what comes from deep inside your hearts. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the video. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.